Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the Catholic faith that comes down to us over 2,000 years from Jesus and the apostles. We want to help you to know your faith, love your faith, and live your faith, and even be able to defend it. And sometimes on this show, we have guests, and today we have a very special guest who we're excited to have back on our show. And his name is Michael Lofton. He is the head, he has a master's degree in theology, and he runs the Reason in Theology show. He's also the founder of St. Maximus the Confessor Institute, and he's been on EWTN, Sirius XM Satellite, Catholic Answers, and many other places around the country. He actually interviews himself. He interviews many people on his Reason in Theology YouTube channel, which I would highly recommend people check out. And some really big names too. They talk a lot about theology. So he is a convert from Eastern Orthodox to the Catholic Church. And today we're going to be talking about Vatican II. There's a lot of controversy about Vatican II. So we're glad that you're here to help us address these questions and concerns and even objections that people have. So thank you for joining us today on this show, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I once a while ago, on my Instagram, I made a post and I said, if you're a Catholic, you must accept Vatican II in big letters. I didn't know that it was going to have so much blowback. A lot of people, I think it was just common sense. It's a Catholic council. You just accept it. But no, there was a lot of blowback and people were saying, oh, no, it's just a pastoral council. No, you don't need to listen to it. And there was like a big debate on there. And so I was like, we need to address this topic a little bit more. There seems to be a lot of confused Catholics out there. So I guess my first question is, do we have to accept the Second Vatican Council? Some people say it's just a pastoral council. Therefore, it doesn't really have any authority and you don't really need to accept it. Would that be an accurate view, or do all councils kind of have authority?
Well, all councils have authority, and some councils are able to make pastoral changes, disciplinary changes, doctrinal teachings, things like that. But let's maybe deal with the first part as far as whether or not this is just merely a pastoral council. Then we'll deal with the issue of assent. So it's true that the Second Vatican Council can be spoken of as a pastoral council insofar as it definitely comes more from a pastoral perspective and is focused on some matters of discipline. But it is also a teaching council. There are quite a few teachings in it. You can't read Lumen Gentium coming away thinking this is merely pastoral. You can't read Dei Verbum thinking this is merely pastoral. It is clear there are actual teachings in the Second Vatican Council. In fact, there's even a teaching that is considered definitive by many theologians, by the Second Vatican Council, that was not definitively settled prior to the council. In other words, it did not necessarily give us any new dogmas, but it did teach something definitively by way of Catholic doctrine. Especially on the matter of the episcopate and the sacramentality of the episcopate in paragraph 21 of Lumen Gentium. So you have a very, very high degree of authoritative teachings being expressed at certain parts at Vatican II. And then you have elsewhere teachings that might be of a step down, a little bit lower than what we see in paragraph 21 of Lumen Gentium, but still really high in the teaching authority spectrum because, after all, it's an ecumenical council teaching. So it's very, very high. Just to give you perspective, it would be just the regular teachings that it proposes, for example, in Lumen Gentium or Dei Verbum, would be considered higher than many of the teachings that are given in, for example, an encyclical, a papal encyclical. So just to kind of give you a perspective, they're pretty high because it is, again, an ecumenical council. So is it a pastoral council? Sure, insofar as it did not issue anathemas and took more of a pastoral approach. Is it merely pastoral? Absolutely not. It is pastoral and a teaching council, and there are quite a few teachings in it. So then that brings us to the question, what level of assent is required? Can we just say, this is merely pastoral, I don't have to assent to it? Even if it were merely pastoral, there is a level of assent owed to pastoral decisions, and that is obedience. But as we just noted, it's not merely pastoral, right? There's teachings there. So there is assent owed to those teachings. The definitive teaching that I mentioned there in paragraph 21 of Lumen Gentium, you would have to give an irrevocable assent to that. That can't be reversed, and that assent, that teaching can't be reversed, and that assent is going to be indefinite. It's irrevocable. Whereas some of the other teachings that might be reformed, but they're still pretty high in their teaching authority. The Second Vatican Council actually tells us what kind of assent is owed to them. It's mentioned in paragraph 25 of Lumen Gentium, where it goes over the magisterium, and it tells us religious submission of intellect and will is what's required. So anybody who tells you they are free to just dismiss the Second Vatican Council is woefully mistaken. And there could be an element of sin involved in doing so, right? If there is knowledge and consent in it, right? Some people might do so out of ignorance, but there could be an element of sin involved whenever a person is dismissing flippantly legitimate teaching authority. That's not a good thing. Religious submission of intellect and will, at the very least, is owed to anything that the council proposes in its teachings. And there are many
And it
of them.
almost seems very close to schism to me, at least the, theological definition of schism, which is withdrawing your, assent and obedience to the church and to the Supreme Pontiff, et cetera. And,
I think it leads to it. Yeah, I think it leads to it.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to offend anyone. I'm not, trying to, call out people, but it almost seems like the radical traditionalists who reject Vatican II wholesale. It almost seems like the traditionalists who reject the Novus Ordo and other things like that. They have a strange similarity to the modernists and the liberals that they condemn. Because modernists will say, well, I don't think the church is correct about this. I think they got it wrong in this area. And, liberals will say, oh, well, the church is right about some things, but I personally disagree with that, or I don't think the church got it right. So in a sense, they're replacing the authority of the church with themselves. And I feel like extreme traditionalists do the same thing. Well, Vatican II got it wrong there. This is what, I really think the church teaches. And it seems like they both are dissenting against the church and the authority of the church. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's exactly what I've said previously before in other shows that I've kind of done on a similar topic to this, because what I've observed is the radical traditionalists and the more liberal Catholics seem to be two sides of the same descending coin. Amen. Yeah. One is more conservative, one is more liberal, and yet both of them dissent from lawful teaching authority, right? They withhold assent for things that they're obligated to give it to. So I would say kind of two sides to the same coin. So it's kind of ironic whenever I see radical traditionalists blasting liberals. I just kind of think, but you have the same problem. You just kind of have it on the other side of the coin. Now, that being said, there are very, very rare cases where a highly trained, well-informed theologian could withhold assent from certain low-level reformable teachings only if they're, number one, very well-informed. They've given, a lot of consideration to this. They're ready and disposed to assent to the church. And if the church itself has taught with a greater authority the opposite elsewhere. And that is not the case with anything in Vatican II, to my knowledge, I would argue. So somebody who might say, well, there's donum veritatis and the theologian can withhold assent in these cases, that's such a rare exception. And people try to take that exception and make it the rule, and it's wrong.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. They try to, it's almost like the same kind of reasoning where people just, flame everyone online and they yell and they scream and they condemn others and they call them idiots. And then they say, well, Jesus, flipped tables. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Jesus also loved everyone with a perfect love and died for them on the cross. That's not a justification for your anger and the way you act and being a jerk about
Right.
it. So
Right.
I feel like, we justify a lot of our actions, but the bottom line in all this is we do have to accept the Vatican Council as Catholics. It's an authoritative, officially called council by an official and authoritative pope. Even though
Mm.
we might not like everything he says it and does, it is an authoritative council. And I think that's the bottom line, isn't it?
I agree. When you start saying that an ecumenical council can be dismissed, there's some serious problems that's going to lead to down the road if you carry that out consistently. Now, that's not to say that the church itself, in a future ecumenical council, can't reverse some of its pastoral approaches. Obviously,
Right.
it can.
Right.
But we haven't had such a council. So that council hasn't happened yet. So until then, we need to go with what the Second Vatican Council has given us. And if the church later on says, okay, well, this approach that we've taken at Vatican II in some of these matters didn't really work out well, we're going to reverse course on this or that issue. So be it. I mean, if that's what the church decides to do prudentially, wonderful. But unless the church decides to do so, we're bound um, to give it at the very least a general disposition in favor of what the church is doing. Doesn't mean that we have to say every single decision that the church has made is absolutely prudential. No. But there still is a certain level of obedience and assent required to the vast majority of things that we find in Vatican II.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It almost seems like to me that Protestants, rebel against, Catholicism, and they say, or even atheists. Let's take an atheist, and they'll say, "Oh, well, look at the Bible. The Bible says this," and they just assume that it's wrong. Not that they don't assume that maybe they interpret it incorrectly or that they don't understand it. They just pull something out of context and say, "See this." And I feel like many extreme traditionalists do the same thing with Vatican II. First of all, most of them have not read Vatican II. The majority of the people who are hostile to it have not read the documents, and I can't stress that enough. And I've seen that over and over again through debates and discussions that I've had. But they'll take just little tidbits out, and instead of giving the church, which they're part of, the benefit of the doubt, because atheists definitely don't do that to our church and Protestants don't do that. And they almost have the same kind of mentality, which it's doubt first rather than trusting the church that has been here for the 2000 years and that Jesus has given his Holy Spirit to guide and lead into all truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah, I think that's a disposition we really need to change. And it's so prevalent too these days. At least in my experience online, it is because I have a show online. I deal with a lot of people online, and so the impression that I get is a lot of people aren't properly disposed in the way you just described. So.
Yeah. So I guess the bottom line, Catholics, and many of you guys out there have asked us, is that we do have to accept Vatican II. It is a true Catholic council. Pope Francis is a validly elected pope. So if anyone or any person or any organization tells you differently, they're wrong.
If
They're
I'm
not,
allowed,
it's not Catholic.
if for example, I believe it was Pius XII who noted that whenever a pope settles a matter in an encyclical, even though he's not definitively, settling the matter, he's just simply giving an authoritative teaching on the matter, which could later on be reversed, of course, by the church since it's not definitive. He notes that even in these non-definitive yet authoritative teachings in a papal encyclical, it's no longer open for debate among theologians. An authoritative, though reformable by the church, teaching has been given. It's no longer open for debate among theologians. If that's true of a papal encyclical and non-definitive authoritative teachings on that level, that's much more true for more authoritatively taught propositions by an ecumenical council, even though they may be reformable by the church itself. Most likely they won't be reformed. It is such an authoritative teaching that how much more assent is to be given to that than the papal encyclical and the teachings in them. So the point is this: if I can dissent from the teachings in Vatican II, I can dissent from anything that a pope has taught as long as it's not ex cathedra.
Yeah. No,
Upon what basis are you going to say I have to now accept what the what the popes teach in papal encyclicals? As long as they're not ex cathedra, upon what basis are you going to say I have to accept them? This opens the door to all kinds of liberal problems. So if we're going to be consistent, if we're going to reject Vatican II and its teachings, simply because it didn't issue some kind of canon or anathema or a dogma, then we have to apply the same to pretty much everything lower than that. And that would lead to all kinds of problems.
very well said. And I'm glad you made that distinction. That's a very good distinction. So thank you. Let's move into more of the problems people have with Vatican II and address some of the concerns people have, objections people have, and things that we'll often hear out there, and many Catholics hear online. Now, some people will say that Vatican II itself is the problem, and they'll focus on the myriad, the cascades of problems that have happened since Vatican II. To me, this is an emotional problem. Just because there's problems in the church and you attribute it to Vatican II, you kind of have to prove that, because there were many problems after many councils, is Nicaea, which had 75 years worth of problems. Does that mean that council is evil or that council is wrong? So for me, it seems more like an emotional argument, but I guess my question is, what about the problems in the church? There are a lot of problems in the church, and they have come down to us since Vatican II. But are the documents of Vatican II the problem, or do the problems lie elsewhere, or perhaps both?
It's a complex question because on the one hand, I would say that there are some reversals and changes in course when it comes to the Second Vatican Council that people are picking up on. They're not entirely without precedent. For example, it speaks about sharing in sacred things with Eastern Orthodox, right? Sharing in communion with them in certain limited cases. That's not entirely foreign to our history, but it is somewhat of a reversal. And there are some new aspects to that disciplinary change that definitely go against the last maybe 250 years or so.
Sure.
So it's going to seem like a reversal, and to an extent, there are some changes there. So people are picking up on that, right? So I do want to give them that. They're saying that there are some changes made by the Second Vatican Council, not only disciplinary, but there's also a change in tone. Some of the things that it expresses in Lumen Gentium 14 through 16 about non-Catholics, those things have precedent. They're there in the pre-conciliar era, but they're definitely expressed a little differently in Lumen Gentium. Not entirely without precedent, but there's definitely a difference, for example, in the way a non-Catholic is seen in maybe Unum Sanctum and maybe the Council of Florence, and how Vatican II presents them. They're compatible. They're not entirely opposed to each other. So they are reconcilable, but there's definitely a different approach in the way they speak about a non-Catholic and different things that it emphasizes. So people are picking up on that, and they're seeing rightly that there are some changes here. The problem is they think that the church doesn't have the authority to make that change. And number two, they think it's entirely without precedent. And so when you start to look at these changes, ones that are actual changes, you'll note that it's not entirely without precedent if you start to dig deep into history. And you'll also note the church has the authority to do these things. Any maybe reversals that it offers are in disciplinary matters, which of course the church has authority to do so. And there have been bigger changes disciplinary that have been made prior to Vatican II. So if these are ineligible, what about the previous ones, right? And any reversals in doctrine, which I personally don't believe it has any reversals in doctrine. But if you were to somehow prove that maybe Dignitatis Humanae reverses some doctrinal teachings, Some of the doctrinal teachings that it would have reversed were so low level in the magisterium that the magisterium is able to reverse those things because they were taught non-definitively, and the magisterium has reversed them with a greater authority now by the Second Vatican Council. So even if you were to show that, maybe what Dignitatis teaches on this particular matter is opposed to what Leo the 13th taught in this encyclical, well, I don't accept that. I don't concede that. But even if you were to prove it, I would simply note that the propositions that Leo the 13th gives in his papal encyclicals don't outweigh a ecumenical council, and they were non-definitive teachings to begin with, so they're eligible to be reversed by the magisterium itself.
Yeah.
So
very interesting.
I think that's part of the problem, is people are picking up on some changes, but they aren't aware that the church is able to do these things and there is precedent for them. A lot of times there's also misunderstandings on their part, so they're making a mountain out of molehill. They're thinking that the church teaches one thing whenever it's not. They're thinking that now the church is saying that universalism is true and relativism is true, and that's not what it's teaching.
I see that and hear that all the time.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church teaches now, since Vatican II, that all religions can go to heaven, and everyone pretty much goes to heaven, even atheists. And they don't actually read the documents.
Yeah, I don't think that's a tenable position if you actually read Lumen Gentium 14 through 16. I don't think anyone could maintain that position. And of course, well, what do we do with the fact that the bottom fell out after the Second Vatican Council? In a sense, the bottom had already been falling out prior to the Second Vatican Council, so I'm not entirely sure that things were so perfect prior to Vatican II. But sure, there were definitely some changes after the Second Vatican Council in culture and society that were probably more radical than prior to the council. But is that necessarily because of the council, or is that because of things going on in society? I mean, just look at the 60s and the 70s. They were pretty rough. So could it be that? Could it be also that a lot of people left the church because they maybe misunderstood some of the changes that were being made at the Second Vatican Council? Maybe. Could it also be that a lot of people left because there weren't enough changes made? Maybe the church, because it has not embraced artificial contraception, maybe that was a deal breaker for a lot of people. They're expecting it to do so.
And we know historically that that's true.
Yeah.
There
could be many reasons.
Yeah, there was a huge fallout after Humani Vitae. And almost, I would even say, an all-out satanic attack and assault against the church, even from clergy and bishops who were counseling the Pope to change it. And then when he didn't, they were already to the media before it was even released saying, the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. We tried to give him the counsel. He didn't listen to us. And all these offended theologians were like basically telling man and woman and child alike that the Pope got it wrong this time. You just follow your own consciences. And that erodes the foundation of the church. And, that's just one aspect that people don't consider, or maybe some people consider, but generally on a wide scale, it's not considered.
Yeah, it's a very problematic position to merely follow one's conscience on this matter when you already have a official intervention on part of the magisterium. Not to mention what one might be able to argue is something that's taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium on the matter of artificial contraception. So, it's very disturbing to hear anybody say that you just got to follow your conscience on this issue. Because of course the conscience has to be informed by what the magisterium teaches, right? You could have you could have a poorly formed conscience. Well, maybe absolutely, if somebody has a poorly formed conscience, yes, they just, as far as their initial response, it needs to be in accord with their own conscience. Sure. But long term, you have to develop that conscience to be in accord with what the magisterium teaches. So if you have a faulty conscience, you need to be aware of that so that you can adjust that, and so that you can give assent to what your conscience now tells you, having properly formed it.
Now, are there any doctrinal errors? I think you hinted at this, but some people say, there's doctrinal errors in Vatican II. There's no actual heretical teachings in Vatican II, though, is there?
There wouldn't be any heretical teachings in it. A heretical teaching would have to be something that the church would propose that would be contrary to a dogma. And I don't know anything in the Second Vatican Council that is contrary to a dogma. Now, I am aware of some parts that some people have misread to be contrary to dogmas, for sure. But not anybody who is well studied, would, in my opinion, would really be able to come away with the interpretation that Vatican II has gone against this or that dogma. Those are usually the people who are just kind of armchair theologians that don't know a whole lot about the magisterium. Maybe they've read a few canons from Trent and they then read a few sentences from Vatican II and they think that they're contrary to each other, and that's it. Look, the whatever divergence there is between Vatican II and maybe Trent on some matters or other things like Unum Sanctum, for example, there's a great wider gulf, I should say, between some of the things in the preconciliar era and some of the teachings in the early church. So if somehow Vatican II is irreconcilable with the past, then Catholics have been in trouble for a very long time, because there have been some greater areas of divergence, I would say, even prior to Vatican II.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people tend to take, kind of like Protestants, take the Bible out of context against the Catholic Church. I feel like extreme traditionalists take Vatican II out of context if it fits their already preconceived ideas. They'll just say, oh, well, you believe everyone goes to heaven now, or there's no sacrifice of the mass anymore, or you believe, all Muslims can be saved, and because they believe in the one true God. And they'll just throw these things out there, willy-nilly. They won't actually look at the rest of the council. What does it say? What is the context of that statement and the book and the rest of the council and the church in itself? I mean, Pope John Paul came out after the council, even though people had confusion on it, and he clarified a lot of this stuff. He said specifically that Islam is not a religion of salvation. They have no atonement. They reject Jesus Christ. I mean, he's clear about that. And so I think when we look at the full context, it's very hard to say that that Vatican II has changed things or is doctrinally in error, or for example, that, oh, well, let's go talk to the religions of the East. Now, some people took that as, oh, let's go learn from each other, even though the council does not even remotely say that. And in fact, throughout the documents, especially in the document of missionary activity, it talks about Jesus being the only way to heaven. There is only one church. Peter is the only one leader of that church. There's only one door, by which people can be saved, and that's through the church and baptism. And the church is pretty clear that the goal of evangelization and ecumenism is to bring people back to Jesus Christ and his holy church. And I don't see, when reading the council in context and taking all of this together, it's very difficult to say that Catholic Church, really made big doctrinal changes.
Yeah, I think if you have a proper reading of the things that are taught there in the Second Vatican Council, I don't think that you could come away saying that there's actually a contradiction. Not at the level of dogma. You might say that there is a reversal in some disciplinary matters. I'd agree with you on that. Sure.
Yeah, and there's a couple other bigger areas which we'll talk about, a little bit later, but it's just sad that people who haven't read the documents are so sure that it's wrong. It's kind of like Mormons have never actually studied history, but they're so sure that the Catholic Church had 3 popes, and the Crusades were just horrible, mass murders of people who just weren't part of the Catholic Church. It's like people feel so strongly about stuff that they've never actually studied. And I feel like that's where we've devolved into in our culture today. It's almost become a meme theology or a Twitter theology. You read stuff online and it must be true. And we really need to step it up, because the Catholic Church and sorry, I'm on a soapbox. This is your show, but the Catholic Church has a long historical scholarly tradition of intellectualism. And as Catholics, we need to get back to that. We have devolved into really shabby and shoddy arguments, and we need to do better.
Yeah, it's a reactionary approach. It's an emotional approach because they're reacting to problems that they see today. Some of them are misplaced as far as their concerns, and some of them are right. They rightly are concerned about certain issues. So, but they see Vatican II as, the easy target, right? It's kind of the whipping boy. It's the easy answer. It's the easy target. It's the easy thing to go to if you're frustrated with what you see going on today. And if you idealize the past and you see Vatican II as a whipping boy, you're just gonna say, oh well, it's the fault of the Second Vatican Council. And I'm not so sure that really it's that simple.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not. And before we go on to the next question, I just say that I read a book which was fantastic. If anyone wants to read it, it's called The Decline and Fall of the Catholic Church in America. And it actually unleashes all of the reasons of how we ended up where we are today. I mean, because the Catholic Church used to be in ghettos before Vatican II. We believed one thing, but then the church wanted to open itself up to go out and evangelize the world. But at the exact same time, the world was exploding and imploding with anarchy and sexual revolutions and all of this other liberalism, modernism, and everything. It's just like a perfect storm. And it opened the doors literally at the perfectly wrong time. And so many nuns and priests, I think 10,000 priests left the church in 10 years because they got caught up in the anarchy and rebellion and just wanting to live it out and not follow the rules and be shackled down anymore. 50,000 nuns left the church as well. And people don't consider that left a huge hole in the church. And so they started bringing anybody in, and they relaxed psychological evaluations, seminaries were infiltrated. I mean, just so many problems. And so for someone to dumb it down and say, oh, it's just Vatican II, it's literally not possible just to blame it all on Vatican II when there's so many other circumstances.
Yeah, I just think it's a little bit more complicated than to just say it's all the fault of the Second Vatican Council. One might be able to rightly criticize certain prudential decisions of the Second Vatican Council at best, but that would pretty much be it, right? We don't have
some of the
to.
documents that were a little ambiguous, perhaps. They could have been clearly more defined.
I think that there could have been more clarity, not only just clarity, but they intentionally wanted to refrain from taking a negative and critical tone and to take more of a pastoral and positive tone. And we might be able to criticize that and say, well, that didn't really work out very well.
Right.
Maybe you could do that, but that wouldn't be really the first time that the church has done that, and maybe kind of used ambiguous statements and conciliar documents. That goes back to the First Council of Nicaea, and then we have the same problem with arguably Chalcedon, and then we have the same problem definitely going on at Florence and Trent. So it wouldn't be the first time that the church has done this. But I think that you can rightly, as long as it's being done respectfully, criticize certain aspects of the Second Vatican Council along those lines, as long as one is, number one, being respectful, and then still also giving proper assent to its teachings, right?
Exactly.
As long as one is doing that, sure, we can have that discussion.
Yeah, and thank you for that. It's so much. We could have a whole show just on that, but let's move on to one big problem that people have, and they think Vatican II is to blame for it, and that's the new Mass, the Novus Ordo. Some people will say that the Novus Ordo, for our listeners, as opposed to the Latin Mass, for non-Catholics, we have a lot of Protestants who watch our channel. There's a difference between the Latin Mass, which is, a very ancient rite within the church, an ancient Mass, but and then with Vatican II, more of the modern languages came about, and here we have the English Masses. So a lot of people will say that the new Mass is invalid, and they'll even go to the extreme to say that people cannot, in good conscience, attend a Mass that is not in Latin. So what would you say about that? Is the Novus Ordo a valid Mass, and are Catholics able to attend?
If the Novus Ordo is not a valid Mass, and if one is not able to attend them, on principle, not because there maybe is some kind of subjective issue at a particular parish, but as a matter of principle, one is not able to attend it and its Masses are invalid, then the church has defected from the faith, and one should no longer consider Catholicism. If that were true, you've sold the farm. Why still be Catholic at this point? At that point, Eastern Orthodoxy might need to be given a second look, or Oriental Orthodoxy or something else. I don't know, maybe Protestantism. I clearly don't take that position, right? I don't believe that the Novus Ordo is invalid. Let me first say this, just to give a little perspective. If you were to say, Michael, would you rather attend a traditional Latin Mass, even though I don't like that phrase, I'll still use the term, because that's what most people are going to be familiar with. Would you rather attend a traditional Latin Mass, or would you rather attend the average Novus Ordo? I would say I'd rather attend the traditional Latin Mass, right? Than the average Novus Ordo. Now, if somebody were to say, well, but if you had a Novus Ordo that is done properly, right, the ideal form of it versus the ideal traditional Latin Mass, which would you rather attend? I would say actually the Novus Ordo, the ideal version of it, not the one that you will encounter at regular parishes where it's not being done properly. And the reason why is there have been a lot of things that have happened in the liturgical history of the Roman tradition that the Second Vatican Council rightly reversed. There were a lot of innovations that were brought about in the Roman Rite that you can see, especially in the Tridentine liturgy, that though might be good, they're not evil, they're not harmful. I don't think they're best. I don't think they're ideal, and they're definitely innovations and not the previous form of how things were generally done in the Roman Rite, such as communion under one kind. And less of an actual participation on part of the congregation. Those are just, and there, so of course the restoration of the chalice, more participation on part of the faithful when it comes to chanting and things like that. I think that
extra readings.
Extra readings. I think those are good things. But of course, along with those came some bad things after the fact, a lot of abuses. And some that aren't actual abuses, but I don't think that there are ideals, such as versus populum. I don't prefer that. I don't think it's evil, but I also don't think that it is the ideal. I think the priest should be facing liturgical east at Orientum. So there's a give and take there. There were some good things that came out of the post-conciliar liturgical reform, and then there were some things that didn't work out so well and I think need to be reversed. But that being said, personally, I prefer more the Byzantine liturgies. But if you were to ask me in the Roman Rite, that's kind of what I would say there. So having said all of that, I would say both are valid. I might prefer the traditional Latin Mass compared to the average Novus Ordo, but I will say an ideal Novus Ordo versus an ideal traditional Latin Mass. I actually think the ideal Novus Ordo is better and is more historically proper to the Roman Rite. The problem is most people don't see that. That's what most people don't experience. So when they hear Novus Ordo in their mind, they're thinking something else.
So wait. So the Tridentine Mass is not the Mass of all time?
It's not. And really, when you study the history of the Roman Rite, you'll end up becoming a little bit more comfortable with the post-conciliar liturgical reforms, just because you'll see how many things were changed from the 900s on in the Roman Rite. So if we're going to criticize the post-conciliar liturgical reform just in general, right? Not making just a particular criticism here and there, but just the whole thing, and just saying we need to press the reset button, go back to the traditional Latin Mass, because that's the way things should be done, and there's all these innovations afterwards. If we're really going to use that approach, we should apply it consistently and say, well, we really shouldn't accept the Roman Rite at all, because the Roman Rite has been engaging in all kinds of liturgical innovations for a very long time, for better or worse. And again, I'm not saying these liturgical innovations on part of the Roman liturgy are evil. No, whenever, for example, the chalice was withheld from the laity, it was for a good reason at the time. Right. So I don't think that that's something evil, and I don't think that people are receiving less grace. But is this the ideal expression liturgically? No, it's definitely not.
Yeah.
Same thing for withholding communion from infants. Whenever the Roman tradition um, stopped doing that, it's not something evil. It's not just entirely taking people away from God or something. It's not just excluding infants from the kingdom of heaven or anything. But it's definitely not the ideal liturgically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, and I think this goes back to what we were saying before, where people take one thing and they just attack Vatican II. When they'll say, "Oh, well, look at the Novus Ordo, look at all the abuses, look at all the bad things. Therefore, Vatican II is bad." And they keep making this association that does not hold up. Because if anyone's read the documents of Vatican II did not call for what we have today, the way we have it today. It does not hold up. I mean, there were so many
Mhm,
more things that
mhm.
Vatican II called for, and even the things that could be changed, like the primary instrument being the organ or chants and things like that, we're supposed to have permission from the bishop, not just have every priest everywhere willy-nilly change to whatever he felt and fancied in himself. And I think that's an important note that people don't realize. I go to a church sometimes 2 towns over, and the mass is a Novus Ordo mass, but it's half in English and it's half in Latin. The priest faces the tabernacle, and even when he turns around to face the audience, he never looks at us. He looks at the floor or he looks at the sky because he realizes that it's not a show; it's a prayer from beginning to end, and it is the most reverent mass. Almost everyone, receives kneeling or on the tongue. There are chants that all the ordinaries are in Latin, and so this is what Vatican II, more, akin to what Vatican II wanted. They didn't just want a wholesale extinguishing of what we had before. And it's such a beautiful mass. And I would agree with you. While I love the Latin mass and it is beautiful, I actually prefer the mass to be done this way, because not only can I participate and enter more deeply, it still has the transcendence and the reverence which the Latin mass brings and is known for and is beautiful.
And that was another one, which though I prefer kneeling and on the tongue in the Roman Rite, I don't think the way communion on the hand is done today in the Roman Rite is done very well. So I think it's better to just kneel and do on the tongue. Having said that, though, we still have to recognize that communion on the tongue is an innovation. The general way that East and West did communion in the first millennium was on the hand, though it was done extremely reverently, not the way it was done today.
Right.
So there have been some innovations here. So again, if we're going to criticize the post-conciliar liturgical reforms and say, "Oh, it's just an innovation," some of them actually aren't innovations. It's kind of a restoration. But even then, if we're going to say, well, it's an innovation such as versus populum, okay, but what about all the innovations in the Tridentine Mass? What do we do about
Yeah.
those? Um, Now, some are going to accuse me of antiquarianism, and I'm not saying, well, just because something is ancient, that makes
Right.
it best. No, 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 no. That's why I said I think it's actually better to go with the innovation of communion on the tongue
Right.
rather than communion on the hand. The communion on the hand is the ancient way, but I would say in the Roman Rite, it'd be better to do it on the tongue than to be haphazard in the way it's done today and careless in the way it's done today. So I'm not promoting antiquarianism. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's best.
Right. And I think that's a great point and a great distinction. I actually made a video on in the tongue or in the hand, and I talked about the ancient tradition, being first in the hand, and got flamed for it, of course, by a lot of people. But people say, "Oh, there's only two circumstances," and most places say there's only two people. But I named at least, if I remember correctly, six.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's way more than two. Yeah, and the problem is some people just kind of go with some of the quotes that you find online.
Exactly.
If you dig deeper than that and really go to some of the primary sources, you'll find that there's way more than just two, as you just
Mhm.
noted, six. I
Yeah.
mean, there's even more than that. It
Right.
was clearly the case until it was right around 898 where we start seeing in the West communion on the tongue. Prior to that, it was in the hand.
And I just want for our viewers, before everyone freaks out and has a kind of a tizzy fit here, we're not advocating communion in the hand, just in case
Yeah.
people want to misinterpret what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
We both prefer communion on the tongue and kneeling. That is the reverent
Yeah.
way
When
to
I,
do it.
when I go to the Roman Rite, I receive on the tongue.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Me too.
that's me personally. But again, if we're going to be consistent and criticize liturgical innovations post-conciliar, why don't we do the same thing about the innovations that have been happening for the last 1,000 years? Because the Eastern Orthodox are just going to turn back around and say, you're not going far back enough. You need to criticize the last 1,000 years of your tradition. And so
no, that's an amazing point. And I really don't think people are well informed on that history and on a lot of the history in the church. So thank you. Thank you for that. Do you have time to move on to ecumenism?
Yeah.
A lot of people have talk about Vatican II promoting a false ecumenism. And for anyone out there who doesn't know what ecumenism is, well, I'll let you explain that, what it is originally meant to be, and then, what people think it is according to Vatican II. But basically, in a nutshell, people are saying that since Vatican II, all religions are basically the same. Everyone can go to heaven. We have to, kind of learn from each other, dialogue from each other, and, take the best of all religions. But and really, the Catholic Church used to teach that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church anymore, but we don't really follow that anymore, and all of these other objections. But, what would be your thoughts about ecumenism? What is it? What is it supposed to be according to Vatican II? And how has it been abused since then? So that, there is a lot of confusion about it.
It's a great deal of confusion. It's probably the area about the Second Vatican Council that there is the most confusion about, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, of course, the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium 14 through 16 reaffirms the dogma that there is only salvation in Christ. It reaffirms that explicitly. There's only salvation in Christ and only salvation in his church. That is reaffirmed in Vatican II. So anything else that it says has to be interpreted through that lens. We have to put those glasses on, and anything else that we're going to read has to be with those glasses on.
Exactly.
So there's only
Context.
salvation in Christ and through his church, right? And there's only one church, right? The Catholic
and not
Church.
Just Lumen Gentium, if I may jump in, but missionary activity, the document on ecumenism, they all state these as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're going to find in the same section that I'm mentioning there, 14 through 16, especially paragraphs 15 and 16, is it begins to speak about ways in which non-Catholics are related to the church and the possibility of salvation for them. And you might ask the question, well, wait, how could a non-Catholic be saved if there's only salvation in Christ and his church? This isn't new to Vatican II. This was already answered and had been something that was being answered for the last 500 years. Ever since the discovery of the New World, theologians and the church itself had to start rethinking the way some of its assumptions, not its teachings, but its assumptions. The teaching has remained the same, but some of the assumptions that have changed that prior to the discovery of the New World that many Christians had was that everybody was culpably ignorant, or was culpable for their ignorance of Christ if they were ignorant of Christ. So if they were ignorant of Christ, they're culpable for it, or they're actively rejecting the truth, right? So if they're not a Catholic, it's because they're either culpably ignorant or because they know the truth, but they despise the truth and are rejecting it. Therefore, they're going to hell. That assumption, which was never dogmatized, was just that. It was an assumption. And with the discovery of the New World, people had to take a step back and say, wait, we might need to, check that assumption. And so, of course, that's what, in fact, numerous theologians under the auspices of the popes did, and popes themselves in the magisterium began to concede that, okay, well, it's not necessarily the case that everybody is vincibly ignorant. It's not necessarily the case that everybody is fighting against the truth, that they're aware of the truth and they're just fighting against it. But it is possible that one could become or be a member of the church. And well, they could be a member of the church without being a formal member. So they could be a member of the church receiving the grace of God without being an actual card carrying, I've been, received into this or that Catholic church. And we can go into details on how all that works, but that was a point that had been conceded for quite a while already by the Catholic Church prior to the Second Vatican Council. So not subtracting from anything Unum Sanctum has said, or not subtracting from anything Florence has said, maintaining the fact that it's only in submission to the Pope, it's only in Christ, it's only in the church. The question, though, is, could somebody be in Christ? Could somebody be in his church? Could somebody be disposed to submit to the Pope without actively being aware of it? The church had long answered yes. So if you have a problem with the Second Vatican Council expressing a yes to that, you have a problem with the last 500 years of the Catholic Church. So again, if you're going to reject Vatican II on this basis, you really need to reject Catholicism altogether, because this isn't new. This has been going on, and it had been authoritatively taught even by the magisterium prior to Vatican II. What Vatican II kind of does, though, is it takes all the bits and pieces that were here and there from theologians and the consensus among theologians and from the magisterium itself, and it kind of puts them all together. That's kind of what is new with Vatican II. It just kind of takes all the pieces and assembles them in a way that is very clearly expressed, instead of finding all the individual Lego pieces here and there. It puts them all together and shows you, hey, this is a ship, right? So that's kind of what Vatican II does.
Yeah. And it makes sense, I guess.
It's, well, if you don't mind, let me just clarify so that people don't misunderstand. It's not saying that people can be outside of the church and be saved. What it's saying is somebody could be a member of the church, a member of the Catholic Church. They could be in Christ without formally having entered the Catholic Church. And this really shouldn't be new, because the concept has been there since the earliest age with baptism of desire, or baptism of blood, and things to that extent, right? Somebody hasn't actually been washed with water, but they have received the grace of regeneration nonetheless. That concept of receiving God's grace and the grace of the sacraments apart from the actual means is exceptional, but it is there, and it is even affirmed by the Council of Trent, which speaks about how it's necessary that one be a member of the church to be saved, and that they receive the waters of regeneration either by receiving the sacrament itself or the desire thereof. So at least the desire of it. So it's possible that somebody could desire these things implicitly without an explicit knowledge of them. Again, this isn't new to Vatican II. So I don't think that there's any changes here. One still can maintain and should maintain the dogmas that the church has taught, that there's only salvation in Christ through his church. But what a lot of people need to refine is how exactly can you be a member of the church, right? They have some misunderstandings there. The ordinary means is by coming in formally into communion with the Catholic Church and receiving its sacraments. That's the ordinary means, and it's the only means that we as individuals have available to us, right? If I want somebody to be saved, I can't just say, well, I just trust that they're a member of the church informally somehow. No, I need to tell them to come into communion with the church, receive its sacraments, right? But God, from his perspective, is not bound to the sacraments, and could say that I'm going to give my grace to them apart from the sacraments. That's possible. And that's all Vatican II is reaffirming.
Yeah. And I think that's really good points. So I just want to be clear to our listeners that the Catholic Church does not teach a false ecumenism. It does not teach, never has taught, not even in Vatican II, that all religions are saved, that anyone can go to heaven, or anything of the sort. it constantly affirms throughout the Vatican documents that Jesus is the only way to heaven, and that there is only one church by which men must enter to salvation, and that's the Catholic Church under the rock of Peter. And it also talks about the sacrifice of the Mass and bringing all Protestants who have divided the body of Christ in schism, and the Vatican II condemns that. But it also calls them to come back to communion with the Catholic Church, the one Eucharistic banquet table, and many other things that I wonder if extreme traditionalists even know exist, because it's so overt in the documents of Vatican II that we're supposed to go evangelize the world. That was the purpose of Vatican II in the first place, is that we're supposed to evangelize a world that has left God, is walking away from God, is too caught up in work and sports and everything else except church. So let's go out and evangelize the world again. So it wasn't supposed to be what many of the new age gurus and clergy of our church have done. Like, hey, Father Thomas Keating, I'm going to go talk to Hindus for 10 years and Buddhists for 10 years and hold retreats with both of them, and then invent something called centering prayer, which I call Catholic, and it's totally not, or Father Richard Rohr, or, many of these other people who are taking from Eastern philosophies. The Catholic Church overtly, even Vatican II, condemns that. Yes, they said to, find common ground, but why? So we can evangelize people with Christ. And I think, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, but I think that's where a lot of the confusion has come in, because people say find common ground. That doesn't mean learn from each other. The Vatican II is so clear that the goal of evangelization and ecumenism is to bring people home to the church.
It speaks about false religions having some truth here and there,
Right.
some things that are good here and there. And that shouldn't be new to us. That goes back to the book of Acts, chapter 17. That's true. That should be new to anybody who's a Thomist, since Thomas Aquinas relied on, a non-Christian individual, Aristotle, right? Prior to the incarnation. So there was clearly some good things in Aristotle, and then other bad things that Aquinas discarded. So we can take the good, discard the bad. That's been a policy of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. I think all Vatican II is doing is it's reaffirming that. I think, though, that some people have misunderstood that, and they thought that, well, because there's some truth in these things, that somehow those truths are salvific in these other religions for a person. And Vatican II nowhere teaches that. And because there are these other true things in them, we could then learn from these other religions. But Vatican II isn't saying that either, because anything true and good that they have, we already have anyway. It already belongs to us. So there's really nothing that we could learn new that is true from a false religion. There is a whole lot of danger, though, because they are mixing truth with error. So there is some danger there if we were to take that approach. And I think some people have wrongly taken that approach.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. And I think the Catholic Church even says what you just stated. I think it's either in their document on Jesus Christ, the bearer of the waters of life, or it's in their on some aspects of Christian meditation. It specifically says we cannot learn anything from any religion, doctrinally speaking. There's nothing that any religion out there can teach us doctrinally that we don't already know, because we have the fullness of truth from Jesus Christ. So, while we might look at Protestants and say, hey, wow, they do youth ministry well, we could learn from that, but they can't teach us anything doctrinally. And that goes for Hindus and Buddhists as well.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to the non-Christians. So I think many people have misunderstood some things that the Vatican Council reasserted there and gone too far with it. And what people do is they see that, they react against it, and therefore they condemn Vatican II for it. But it's not very consistent. It's not very consistent with our tradition historically. It's a reactionary approach. It's an emotional approach. I think we need to be a little bit more level-headed, less emotional, and more objective about this issue, and say we can rightly condemn error where there is error, but we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
100%. We should be condemning a lot of the abuses that have happened, the scandals that are taking place today, the people doing whatever they want. And just, people have a right to be outraged when a priest walks down, or I should say, rides down the aisle up to mass in a mechanical lion. Like there have been clown masses. There have been the most disgusting abuses in the church, and we wholeheartedly condemn those.
Yeah,
So yes, we should be condemning those, but like you said,
absolutely.
let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And I kind of wonder, yeah, we should be angry and upset with all those things and rightly condemn them. But have we given the same amount of diligence to our own souls? I kind of wonder if that's the case.
Hmm.
I wonder if we have criticized our own souls to the same extent that we've criticized these other problems in the church.
Hmm.
I think oftentimes we probably haven't. I know I haven't. I know I've
Yeah.
failed there. So if I've failed there, I imagine there's others who have as well. So we should probably be a little bit more attentive to those things first, and then we'll be in a little bit of a better position to criticize things that are external to us.
Yeah, you're right. That is such a great point, because I think we could, if we are not prayed up and we're not holy, we can go off the track ourselves, even in the guise of being righteous and, condemning others and trying to fight for the truth. We might actually go into schism ourselves, possibly, or even into some untruths ourselves. So that's a great point.
Yeah,
Um,
I know
you
that
have,
it leads to that. I know that
yeah.
it does in many cases. It ends up leading to us going into schism and abandoning the church.
And I saw that recently, when Pope Francis kind of put some reins on the Latin Mass, which we probably don't agree with, may or may not agree with. People were like, "Oh, we need to consider Eastern Orthodoxy. We need to consider SSPX." And I'm like, "Are you serious? Are you listening to what you're saying? Like you're literally talking about leaving the true Church of Jesus Christ because you don't like this disciplinary aspect of what's happening here." So I think it can be very dangerous when we think we know more than the church.
It sheds light on an existing problem of dissent that was already there. It just brought it to the forefront, which ironically, that was what Pope Francis was trying to address when he came out with Traditionis Custodes, kind of proving him right. Um, but yeah, that's the thing. I think that there already is this underlying, in the case of some people, disposition to dissent and to leave the church. They've kind of already done it in their heart. And all these things do is it just kind of brings it out and makes it more manifest. And so we might want to take care of those things first before we start really criticizing other things that are going on in the church. Again, I'm speaking from personal experience because I know I've failed to do that. So having failed to do that, I'm trying to do differently. And I would encourage everybody else to do that. And whenever you do that, and you stop focusing so much on what all is wrong with everyone else in the church, and and you start to focus on, well, look at what all is wrong with me that I need to work on. You come to a very different place. You actually find a lot of peace in it.
Mm,
There's a whole lot of turmoil. There's a whole lot of chaos. There's a whole lot of instability that comes along with emotionally and spiritually, that comes along with um, being caught up in all that's going on in the church today.
yeah,
It'll really do a number on you spiritually.
yeah.
And if you try to take a step back from that and start to be a little bit more introspective, it'll do wonders for your soul. So anybody who's watching, who's kind of experiencing that, is going through that turmoil, try it. I'm not saying close your eyes to and put your head in the sand. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is put things into perspective and focus on your own soul first. And I think you'll find a whole lot more peace taking that approach. So, yeah.
Wow. Wow, well said. Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that's the difference between Luther trying to reform the church like Luther and then trying to reform the church like St. Francis de Sales or John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, who didn't get angry and hostile when the church didn't listen to them or when things kept going bad or when priests did dumb things. They prayed more, they fasted more, they sought Christ more, and through them, Christ changed the world. They reformed the church. St. Francis de Sales was all about never getting angry, never getting upset, never condemning others. He converted 60,000 Protestants back to the Catholic Church because he not only had great arguments, but he had holiness of life. And I think that's what Mr. Lofton here is talking about today, is that holiness of life. And that alone is the only thing that is going to reform our church. And it's the lack of it that's going to keep perpetuating the problems we have. So thank you so much, Michael, for all of your wonderful thoughts. And thank you for everything that you shared with us today. We're so happy to have you back on our show.
Yeah, I was happy to do it.
And did you have any last thoughts? Where can people find you? Where can they get a hold of you or find your stuff?
Yeah. Well, there's a website, of course, reasonintheology.com. You can find out information there, or you can just go to YouTube, type in Reason in Theology, and you'll see the show pop right up.
And it's a great channel, people. Check it out. He is great. He hits on things that most people don't hit on, like intricacies that a lot of people don't talk about, or, people hit on generalities, but he goes deeper. And I really appreciate his channel for that. So thank you, Michael. Thank you for blessing us with your knowledge and coming on our show.
Honor to be on.
And God bless you and your ministry.
Thank you. You too.